What happens when Soviet engineering faces the frozen extremes of Antarctica? One of the toughest vehicles ever designed is born, capable of withstanding temperatures as low as -70 degrees Fahrenheit and braving snowstorms. Unlike the American failures, the Soviets created several generations of this formidable tank, the Kharkovchanka, which dominated the frozen continent. Today, we're telling you how this Russian marvel conquered what once seemed impossible. The Soviet conquest of the cold. In 1948, several Western nations gathered to discuss the division of Antarctica, the last great unexplored land. But there was one important detail: the Soviet Union wasn't invited to the party. Determined not to be left behind, the Soviets responded firmly, "We are going to claim our share of the frozen South Pole." So, in 1955, the Soviet Antarctic expedition was created with the goal of studying the continent and participating in the International Geophysical Year, a global initiative to better understand Antarctica. National pride was at stake, and it was time to face the snow. The first Soviet team arrived in Antarctica in 1955, where they set up 2 small research stations on the Antarctic coast. To get around that inhospitable terrain, they used Soviet military trucks from World War II, which were efficient on the battlefield but not very practical in deep snow. Fortunately, the team also brought along agricultural tractors, which, although slow and lacking insulation against the extreme cold, proved to be quite effective on the icy terrain. These tractors, with their tracks, were perfect for hauling heavy sleds, which allowed the Soviets to make progress in their mission. However, the real lesson came soon after. Antarctica was a monumental logistical challenge. With snow covering everything and few landmarks, any operation required more specialized vehicles. The extreme conditions, with the magnetic South Pole causing interference in compasses and radios, made the situation even worse. Drivers had to navigate by the sun and stars, all while battling the intense cold. The vehicles they were using were far from what they actually needed. The need for a specialized vehicle. In 1957, after facing all kinds of difficulties, the Soviet explorers sent an urgent message to the USSR requesting better vehicles to continue their mission. They reported that the extreme weather conditions were making it increasingly difficult to move forward. The trucks and tractors simply weren't up to the task. That's why they decided that the next expedition should bring more robust vehicles, capable of withstanding the freezing temperatures of Antarctica and the treacherous terrain. It was then that the solution began to take shape. The Soviets came up with a vehicle based on the chassis and propulsion system of the T-54, one of the USSR's most iconic tanks. The ATS tractors were the answer. These vehicles were not only capable of withstanding extreme conditions, but they could also tow large loads of fuel, the vital resource in Antarctica. The logistics of transporting fuel, which made up between 70 and 75% of the total cargo, was essential for the success of the mission. It wasn't just used to power the vehicles, but also to keep the occupants warm. The ATS tractors proved to be highly effective and allowed the Soviets to establish 2 new research stations that would continue operating for decades. The Soviet expedition concluded in 1958, leaving an important legacy in the history of Antarctic exploration. But despite their successes, there were still challenges to overcome. Overcoming new obstacles. Although the ATS tractors were a significant improvement, Antarctica remained relentless. The weather could be even more extreme in the interior regions of the continent, which forced the Soviets to face new challenges. On some occasions, the crew had to light fires under the vehicles to prevent the diesel fuel from freezing, a serious problem in such low temperatures. In fact, sometimes they had to cut the fuel as if it were firewood in order to put it back into the engine. This task was essential to prevent the vehicles from becoming immobilized, which would be a disaster in the middle of the polar cold. Furthermore, when the Soviets tried to cross altitudes above 10,000 feet, the thin air caused the engines to fail due to the lack of oxygen. Modifications, such as the introduction of turbochargers and wider tracks, slightly improved the situation, but something more robust was still needed to carry out the longer and more complex expeditions. The Soviet response, the ultimate vehicle. It was at this point that the Soviets realized the vehicle they needed already existed. It just happened to be in the hands of the Americans. In the 1940s, the United States had developed the famous snow cruiser, a vehicle designed to operate in Antarctica. However, its major flaw was that the Americans chose large tires with little grip, which made it ineffective. Despite this, the Soviets decided to thoroughly study the mistakes made by the Americans and improve upon what had already been done. The Soviet vehicle needed to be something completely different, an all-terrain tracked vehicle, waterproof, capable of protecting its occupants from the elements and providing them with space to live and work in sub-zero temperatures. Additionally, to make repairs easier in the extreme cold, the engine had to be located in the main cabin, so it wouldn't be necessary to go outside to keep the vehicle running. The problem was how to build it in record time. The solution came from an unexpected place: airplanes. The Soviets decided that airplane design, which operated at extreme altitudes and in sub-zero temperatures, could be the key to creating the right vehicle. That's how the Soviet Union turned to the Ukrainian city of Rzeszów, where the Shanka transport engineering plant was located. There, the engineers were given a monumental task: to build the perfect vehicle for Antarctica in just 3 months. Although the deadline seemed impossible, what they created was a true marvel of engineering, the Kharkovchanka, the Soviet beast. What rolled out of the factory was the Kharkovchanka, a vehicle so robust and specialized that it left all previous attempts far behind. This engineering monster was capable of withstanding the most extreme conditions, operating in freezing temperatures, and providing its occupants with a relatively comfortable shelter in the heart of Antarctica. With a design that combined the best of military engineering and lessons learned from past mistakes, the Kharkovchanka became the ultimate vehicle for Soviet exploration on the frozen continent. So, while the Americans were facing failure, the Soviets were triumphant, marking a milestone in the history of polar exploration. The Kharkovchanka not only helped conquer Antarctica, but also left a lasting legacy in off-road vehicle engineering, proving that when faced with the impossible, innovation and determination can overcome any obstacle. The Shanka Shark is one of those vehicles that not only impresses with its imposing size, but also with the innovations it holds inside. Quickly recognized as an evolution of the famous Soviet tank tracks, this snow monster was much more than just an improved track tractor. With notable improvements, such as a fully enclosed cabin that occupied the entire space of the vehicle, the Shanka Shark was designed to provide its crew with a living and working experience without having to face the harsh weather outside. But the innovation didn't stop there. One of the most outstanding features of this vehicle was its ability to insulate itself from the cold. Inside the cabin, a 10-centimeter layer of synthetic wool in the walls helped keep the temperature from dropping more than 1 or 2 degrees per day. Just imagine that. In the midst of the frigid Antarctic landscape, a warm and sheltered cabin for the crew. And not only that, this Shark was powered by a turbocharged diesel engine that delivered over 900 horsepower, which, combined with its 5-speed gearbox, made it a vehicle capable of tackling the toughest and steepest terrains without losing power or reliability. The performance of this gigantic vehicle was impressive. With tracks extended by an extra meter and wider than those of the original tank tractors, it had no rival when it came to conquering icy landscapes and soft snow. Its chassis, although not amphibious, was equipped with protection against cold and water, allowing it to operate in extreme conditions. Although its top speed of 10.8 kilometers per hour didn't make it fast, the power of its engine and its ability to tow up to 77 tons of sled trailers made it an unstoppable machine. But what truly made the Shanka Shark special was its ability to serve as a mobile home. Inside the cabin, the Soviets put all their efforts into creating a comfortable environment. The crew members had access to a small kitchen, a sleeping area where up to 8 people could sleep, an airplane-style bathroom, and even a small garden. In addition, outside the control area for the driver and navigator, the vehicle was equipped with a workshop and a laboratory, turning it into a true mobile laboratory. And for those moments when the crew wanted to go out and observe the sky without having to face the cold, the vehicle had a dome on the roof, offering a clear view of the heavens. However, not everything was perfect. The engine, placed inside the cabin, made maintenance easier, but it also brought some problems. The constant noise from the engine was annoying and made it hard for the crew to rest. Additionally, exhaust fumes would build up inside, covering everything with a black dust. As if that weren't enough, the engine, which was essential for keeping the temperature up, had to be running all night long. This led to a dilemma. If the engine wasn't on, the temperature inside the cabin would drop quickly, putting them in an extremely dangerous situation. And if they kept it running, the heat from the engine became unbearable. The engine oil wouldn't cool down properly, and this made the cabin an uncomfortable mix of extreme temperatures. Despite these inconveniences, the Soviet crew continued their journey toward the South Pole. After 3 months of preparation, in 1959, the Shanka Sharks and other vehicles began their trek into the vast Antarctic. Their mission was to reach the South Pole and prove that the USSR could match or even surpass the United States in polar exploration. Equipped with huge sleds full of fuel, the Soviets set out with uncertainty about what they would find, since the region had not yet been fully explored, not even from the air. But the expedition was not without its difficulties. One of the biggest problems was the exorbitant fuel consumption of the Shanka Shark. At a speed of 6 kilometers per hour, the vehicle burned about 12 liters of diesel per kilometer, which translated to a consumption of 3 gallons per mile. Without a doubt, an exorbitant fuel expense for a vehicle that was also burdened by the weight of its own mechanical problems. The larger tracks, although designed to provide greater traction, would break after 1,000 kilometers, which meant they had to be replaced every 5 days. And not only that, the lack of insulation in the cabin meant that, without the engine running, the temperature would drop below zero at night, putting the crew's safety at risk. Despite these obstacles, 20 days later, the Soviets reached the South Pole, where they met the Americans. This encounter marked a milestone in history, but it also opened the door to new lessons for the designers of the Shanka sharks. The experience in the field and the difficulties of the first generation of these vehicles made it clear that it was time for improvement. And that's how the second generation was born. The Soviets, drawing on all their experience in Antarctica, improved the design of the Shanka sharks. Unlike the first generation, the engine and the cabin were separated, which allowed for better heating and cooling systems. The cabin received more efficient insulation, and the noise from the engine would no longer bother the crew. In addition, an auxiliary engine was added that allowed the heating and electricity to be maintained without having to keep the main engine running. In 1975, the new second-generation vehicles were sent once again to Antarctica, where they became the crew's favorites for being warmer and more comfortable. The Soviets, however, didn't stop there. They had an even more impressive third generation in mind. But unfortunately, the story took an unexpected turn. The fall of the Soviet Union meant the end of this ambitious project. Money was scarce, and the new Russia saw no need to continue developing a third version of a machine that no longer fit into its new plans. So, although the third generation of the Shanka shark never came to be, the 6 remaining vehicles continued operating in Antarctica until recent times.